my blog post about, and I wasn't particularly attacking man because he wasn't the only person involved in this little deception, but this got a lot of attention, and apparently Michael Mann was unhappy, and pretty soon after that, he was calling me a denier on Twitter, and then I started appearing on all these misinformer lists, and by 2012, I was firmly established as a denier, and the Society of Environmental Journalists put together a list, a description of all the climate blogs, and my blog was under the list of denier blogs. And the description says, unlike most other denier blogs, Curry is a real scientist. She looks at both sides of the issues, digs deep into the issues, discusses the uncertainties and all this other stuff. And I said, well, that's a beautiful description of my blog, but why did they accept prima facie that my blog is a denier blog? I mean, it just shows how pervasive and how stupid this whole thing was. So I got tossed into the denier camp. I don't align myself with either side. I've preciously fought for my independence, which included resigning my academic position. So, I think for myself, I think deep, I look at the evidence, make judgments, and it's mostly about trying to better characterize uncertainties and what we don't know. This is a key part of rational policy making, is to understand the uncertainties and what we don't know.
Well, we've got a threefold problem here by the sounds of things in some real sense. I mean, the first problem is kind of a positive feedback loop that you alluded to, is that a lot of attention was paid to this potential issue. A lot of money was put into funding investigation into it. That incentivized the growth of a huge scientific enterprise. That incentivized people who were primarily motivated by the money, including the grants. And I mean, it's hard not to be motivated by that if you want to be a practicing scientist. And so there was a lot of financial and practical pressure to produce an environmentally apocalyptic story. And then you could imagine that's amplified by the fact that reporting that there's no problem on the climate front is not something that's going to produce an attention-grabbing headline, especially in the era of declining attention being paid to legacy media outlets. And so we know perfectly well that human beings are much more sensitive to negative information, comparatively speaking, than to positive information, and that you can attract attention with a story of gloom and threat much more effectively than one that states there's no story here at all or something positive. So that's a big problem. And then the third problem, I would say, is that it's easy for venal and narcissistic politicians, and that's not all of them, to latch on to a convenient money-generating apocalyptic nightmare, to put themselves forward as white knights on the moral front, and to pull the wool over the eyes, and maybe even their own eyes, in relationship to whether or not they're making any practical progress in the actual world. And so there's a situation where we have a set of positive feedback loops, right, operating in sociological space, that are producing a kind of Chicken Little outcome. And so we're running around claiming that the sky is falling and tilting our economic systems in a dangerous direction, and spending untold hundreds of billions of dollars addressing a problem that is ill-defined and likely nowhere near of the magnitude that we think it is. And then I want to follow that with I tried to make a strong case for why you might be regarded with a certain degree of apprehension from the perspective of the climate apocalypse. But I'm also curious about this. The piece of data that has really emerged as most striking to me on the environmental front over the last 20 years is the recent observations, or they've been going on for about 5 years or 10 years perhaps, that one of the consequences of extra carbon dioxide output is that the planet has greened 15% since the dawn of the millennia, and that most of that greening has taken place in what would have otherwise been semi-arid and rather denuded areas. And so I don't see a statistic on the anti-carbon front that's as powerful negatively as the statistic that the planet is 15% greener and that our crops are also, in a consequence, quite a lot more productive on the pro-carbon dioxide front. So, you know, you made the claim earlier that maybe we're in for a period of cooling. That's within the error predictions of the models. But I would like to say, well, why shouldn't I look at the fact that the planet has got 15% greener in 15 years? That's an area bigger than the United States, and say, well, why are we so sure that carbon dioxide output is a bad thing at all? I mean, some of the people who initially hypothesized about the greenhouse effect were quite effusive in their predictions that this would produce a greener, more lush, and more productive world, a more habitable world. So is it unreasonable to put that forward as a proposition?
Again, the apocalyptites are pushing extreme weather events as being caused by warming. You know, the hurricanes, the Pakistan flooding, the heat waves, you know, unusual this, that, and the other. This is what they're pushing as being caused by warming. You know, it's conceivable that there is some element of contribution from fossil-fueled warming to this, but it's because of the large amount of natural weather and climate variability, it's impossible to discern. I mean, if we were to immediately stop emitting fossil fuels, we probably wouldn't notice any change in the weather, you know, throughout the rest of the 21st century. So this is the key error in logic that people have been made. Well, I mean, it's not an error in logic. It's a very effective selling point for the alarmists, but people have bought it. And people have weather amnesia. I mean, if you just look back to the 50s, to the 1950s, to the 1930s or whatever, the weather was much worse, certainly in North America. So it's just something that doesn't make sense. Does that mean we should just keep amping up the fossil fuel emissions? No, we just really don't quite understand the consequences of this, but neither does it imply that we should urgently reduce emissions and disrupt the global energy systems that will make people less off and, you know, less well off and more vulnerable to whatever extreme weather and climate events might happen to occur. So we're hurting ourselves. We're not doing much in the way of reducing emissions